probably already know that colostrum is the first step in starting calves off right. But what are the other factors that come into play? Welcome to Beyond Colostrum, the show where we'll talk about how to optimize your calves with science and research that goes beyond just colostrum. We'll challenge the ways you typically manage your calves, and you might learn some new concepts beyond what you're already used to. Thanks for joining us as we go beyond colostrum.
Well, thank you again for joining us for another episode of Beyond Colostrum. I'm today's host, Juliana Langemeyer. I will not always be the host of Beyond Colostrum, so make sure that you follow along on our YouTube channel so that you can see new episodes where we'll have guest hosts. We'll also have guest speakers to talk about some new topics coming up. But today I have Dr. Mike Nagorski and Dr. Travis White joining me again. We're going to talk about something that maybe we don't want to talk about that's kind of a pain, but heat stress, summer months where it can be extremely hot in certain areas, something that we can't necessarily avoid. So we are going to talk about heat stress today and how that can impact calves. So I first want to ask you, Dr. Mike, what are some signs or some indicators that calves might be suffering from heat stress, or what do you look for when you're walking calves to make sure that that they aren't kind of having some heat stress going on?
Sure. So the biggest indicator typically of heat stress usually aligns with respiratory rates. And, you know, when calves get hot, or even cows for that matter, their respiratory rates will increase because they're not the best at sweating and just sweating it out to cool themselves. Their respiratory rates really get impacted. In fact, if it gets really bad, you will see salivation and then even tongues hanging out, and that would be the worst case. What's really interesting about cattle as well is that typically the time of day that you diagnose the heat stress, it has a tendency to be, there's a tendency to be a lag. And so, for example, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when that sun hits the highest point in the day, people think that that's when most of these animals are most impacted. And actually it's typically, there's about a 3 to 4 hour lag. So most of the time, the worst part will be actually in the evening, when you see the peak of that animal's in court, body temperature and that impacted. So, but yeah, respiratory rate will be primarily the way you'd see that.
Really interesting though, and maybe not a time that you would typically think to check on your calves. You're probably going out there and focusing on the calves to check on them when it's like the peak heat of the day. Is that something that you noticed, Travis? Some of the same indicators when you're looking for heat stress?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, increased respiratory rate, open mouth breathing, standing when they would typically be lying down, maybe another indication, increased water consumption, lethargy. So if they're just tired, exhausted, can't get up, things like that. And I think it's important to think about what thermal transfer things happen can induce or mitigate heat stress, right? So we have conduction. So when the animal's coming into contact with something, is it conducting heat or moving heat away from that animal? So the type of bedding that they're using can be, a conduction source. So for example, I really like sand. Sand is a great bedding for drainage and things like that. But when it's really hot, you'll notice that sun that's outside of, say, the hutch is absorbing a lot of heat and it's transferring that into the hutch, and it can actually exacerbate some of the heat stress. The next way that of thermal transfer would be convection. So is the animal able to convect heat away, or is it absorbing heat? So if it's super hot inside the hutch, and we have these hutches that don't have access to outside air or something like that, so are they just cooking in the hutch, more or less. Radiation would be another one. So do they have access to shade? Can they get out of the sun? Just like Mike alluded to, you take these black-hided cows that are out in the sun 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they're absorbing all this radiant heat. And then a few hours later, we actually see the effects of heat stress. And then third would be evaporation. So do we have airflow over the animal? Is it able to, where it does sweat, or as it breathes, are we able to remove that or use that evaporative cooling to our favor, or 100% humidity and there's no evaporation happening? So those are all things that can kind of, lead to heat stress, or ways that we might be able to mitigate heat stress as well. So especially with calves, if we have hutch raised calves, are we getting some airflow under that hutch so that it can use the evaporative cooling and some of those things? Are we providing adequate shade? Do they have adequate access to water? All of those things. Similarly with a beef calf, do we have shade trees in the pasture so they can get away from that? Do we have, stock ponds that they can go in and bathe in and get cool and use that evaporative cooling to their benefit? But absolutely, just like Mike said, typically it's open mouth breathing, increased respiratory rate, lethargy, things like those.
I live in an area where calving season is during typically not a time of heat stress, but a time of cold stress. We see that a lot up here in the Dakotas, where we're kind of battling with hypothermic calves if they're born kind of in the middle of winter. And we use colostrum on day 1 for newborn calves to help them thermoregulate, to shiver, to warm up. But can that colostral fat found in colostrum actually be beneficial in reducing heat stress for calves that are born in warmer climates?
Yeah, absolutely. So you think about, again, all those ways that we talked about mitigating heat stress. How does the animal mitigate heat stress on it just physiologically? So it's going to increase its respiratory rate. It's going to try to stand up a lot of times so that it's getting more airflow around it. It's going to sweat in areas that it has the ability to sweat. It's going to vasodilate to the ears and the legs, things that have more airflow around it. And all of those things cost energy. The animal has to have enough energy to be able to mitigate this heat stress. So that's where colostral fat becomes really important, because it's a very dense energy source. It provides a lot of energy for that calf to be able to thermoregulate appropriately. The other thing that I think oftentimes we fail to recognize is we see fat as this very dense energy source, right? Which it is. And fat typically releases a lot of energy when it's used. But if we look at fat versus carbohydrates, carbohydrates actually produce more heat in the animal as they digest those carbohydrates. So the colostral fat becomes essential in the especially newborn calves, being able to mitigate a lot of that heat stress. We also know that as animals get heat stress, they'll actually decrease their dry matter intake. So now they're not intaking enough energy. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. They're expending more energy to keep cool, but they're not intaking enough energy to have the energy reserves to do that. So having a high density product or fat that will give them the energy they need to thermoregulate is vitally important.
Absolutely. I also wonder, and Mike, would you be able to talk a little bit about this? How does heat stress affect a cow that's about to calve? Like towards the end of her gestation, she's generating colostrum, she's creating colostrum. So how does heat stress, I'm sure it has an impact on colostrum in that way. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So colostrum is made in the 3 to 4 weeks prior to calving is when you're going to get a big dump of colostrum into that into the udder, right? Or when it's being kind of basically transferred from the blood to the udder. In that time period as well, the calf itself is growing in that last trimester by almost 2/3 of its weight. And so there's a lot of things happening. And when that size of that calf increases, now too, Travis mentioned dry matter intake will go down with that cow. So you really have quite a system of making sure things are right. And so when we're talking about that last trimester, it's very important to maintain dry matter intake, whether that's a beef cow or a dairy cow. We do know that energy will impact colostrum production in especially beef cow calf, and also to a degree in the dairy side of things. And so, you know, if cows aren't eating enough and they're not getting enough energy, that's going to have an impact on the colostrum quantity. Colostrum quality, so the amount of antibodies, the concentration of that, you know, protein are the building blocks of that, right? And so making sure a cow's has adequate protein in their diet, which then again, you could have the right amount of protein, but if the cow's not eating enough of whatever ration a nutritionist comes up with, you'll have a problem as well. And so yeah, heat stress really ties into that through kind of indirect effects on dry matter intake specifically, but both protein and energy are needed to make colostrum. And so however that's impacted, whether it's what we're feeding those animals or the negative impacts of like, yeah, heat stress and dry matter intake, that's going to impact the colostrum to quite a degree.
Yeah, and we've really, you know, Mother Nature, for whatever reason, has really set these calves up for failure, right? So we know that if a calf is heat stressed, its ability to absorb colostrum significantly goes down, you know, by 30% or so. But now we've got this cow that has lower quality and lower quantity of colostrum because she's been heat stressed. But we've also discovered that just calves that are gestated during heat stress will have an inability to absorb an adequate amount of colostrum, even if they're not heat stressed themselves, just being gestated during a period of heat stress. And so again, it's kind of, they get kind of a double whammy. Mom's not producing enough or a high enough quality, and they can't absorb enough of it to protect themselves. So we have to be really cognizant of this, that those times of the year when those cows are significantly heat stressed, and trying to mitigate that so that we get a higher level of colostrum produced as well as a high enough level absorbed.
So what suggestions then do you have? Like, when you know that this calf already has so much working against it, but there are things that we can do to improve that colostrum quality. So what would you suggest to a producer that's maybe working with the heat stress calves towards late gestation and also those challenges that they have as soon as they're born? What's a suggestion that you have in improving the colostrum quality that calf will receive?
Yeah, the biggest thing are all those things we talked about with heat mitigation, you know, so getting heat mitigation programs in place, whether it's sprinkler systems, shade cloths, access to clean water sources, you know, so having all these areas of heat mitigation, and then understanding that if I have this calf born and I think the cow may have experienced some heat stress, I may have to do some additional things. So I may have to enrich the colostrum to, you know, get a higher level of antibody into that calf, or, you know, if it's a beef cow calf operation, maybe I've got to give a supplement to that calf so that it's getting an adequate amount of colostrum. Now, it's going to be extremely difficult to identify, well, this cow had heat stress during the third trimester and this cow didn't. But trying to identify maybe those calves that are more affected by heat stress, you know, so are they born weaker than their cohorts, or you know, are they slow to get up? Are they just not as aggressive as they should be? And then, you know, maybe that's a red flag that we got to do something a little more with this calf because it seems a little weaker than the other calves being born.
Is that something that you would recommend, is kind of looking at calf by calf to determine, hey, should we maybe do something different if we're interpreting that this calf maybe is showing signs of heat stress, or that cow that calf is out of maybe did have heat stress toward the end of gestation? Or would you suggest, and maybe it depends on the farm, would you suggest maybe certain times of year where heat stress is more common and maybe shifting some of their protocols for those newborn calves?
Yeah, so in the dairy industry, it's fairly simple, right? We measure bricks quality as we see bricks go down. We have to take some measures to improve that colostrum quality. In the beef cow calf sector, it becomes a little more difficult. But you know, I typically educate people on using historical data, right? So what did the calves look like last year? Last year was a really hot year. We had some drought conditions. How did the calves perform after they were born? And if they had some issues, then maybe we look at going to a supplement program on all the cows. Or again, if we can't supplement all the cows, at least trying to get eyes on those calves routinely so that we can identify calves that are weaker or slower to get up and get going.
Okay, is there anything that you would add on ways that you would help educate or recommendations that you would have for producers that maybe are struggling with some heat stress challenges?
Yeah, I think, just additionally, the enrichment application is a very powerful one. And we see that during times, as a company, we collect from over 1 million cows currently. And when we look, and so we've been able to develop quite a few data points over the course of time, and over the 20-year period that Saskatoon Colostrum has been around collecting from dairy cows directly from farm, we see upwards of 20% drop on the average with colostrum quality into the summer months. And that leg continues into the fall months because you've got cows gestating in the middle of that summer month. Well, then, sometimes they don't calve till September, October, or into that fall. You still have to follow those, right? So this really does apply. It can apply for upwards of a 4 to 6 month period in that sense. And we don't just say it's just now in hot time. It's that leg too we got to be cognizant of. And so, I would just emphasize if you're a dairyman brixing, and we have a tool, the best tool for that is enrichment, and we have an app that you can download off the App Store and implement that program quite readily, whether you're pooling your own colostrum or collecting directly from a cow. The biggest thing, as we said, is colostrum's most important, and trying to monitor that quality through the summer months and even into the fall months, to be honest. I think it's really important, and it's a good tool to use. Doesn't mean you're going to use it in every one. I think over on the average, you're talking anywhere from 13% to 30% of the colostrum will need to be, enriched. But if you're not brixing it, you don't know, you're blindly doing it, you got to be brix testing every batch of colostrum, every milking, if you will. And that process is easy to do, but it's just getting there and getting that type of a process going for monitoring.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. It's better to know before you feed that calf instead of waiting until you see some of those detrimental effects of that calf maybe not receiving the colostrum quality that it needed. So you had mentioned, and I just want to make sure that it's clear for anyone that's watching this, we do have an app on the App Store that's called the Colostrum Calculator. And that's what you can do, kind of like Mike said, you can learn how to enrich your on-farm maternal colostrum to improve the Brix percentage by adding some colostrum color. There's another episode on our YouTube channel that also talks more about the details of enrichment. So go ahead and check that out if you want to learn more. Travis or Mike, anything else that you want to add about heat stress?
Yeah, I guess nothing additional. It's just we have to be mindful of it and manage it where we can. Again, on a dairy operation, crawl in the hutches, crawl inside, see how the calf is feeling. Are there ways that we can mitigate that heat stress? Because if you're hot, the calf's hot, and you're only in there for a few minutes, but imagine that calf having to live there. And so I'm a big proponent of get down on your hands and knees, get into their environment, see what it feels like to live where they live. And is that somewhere that you would be comfortable staying?
Really good recommendation. Anything else to add, Mike?
Yeah, I think, I think all the things we covered with, definitely like Travis alluding to, there's definite interventions you can take to help mitigate heat stress, right? You talked about, well, what do you do with like enrichment? And one thing I just was thinking about this. We also deal what we call with post day one colostrum interventions. So feeding colostrum replacer to mitigate transition milk for the first 10 to 14 days of life in the milk program. So whether you're feeding whole milk or milk replacer, we do a lot of work in the western regions out in Arizona and California where heat stress is very imminent this time of year and in even the next couple of months. And we do see great benefit to supplementing the milk program in that first 10 to 14 days, because the calves during heat stress actually do get what we call leaky gut syndrome. And we see this even with high endurance athletes or heat stressed athletes for that matter. You get breakdown of your gut, and that same thing happens with a calf. And so we can provide what we call post day one nutrition via colostrum replacer into the milk feeding scheme. Like I said, that first 10 to 14 days. And we've been able to see positive benefits to that. We're feeding 100 to 120 grams of colostrum replacer per head per day into the milk feeding scheme. And we see really great benefits to that. Just especially when you're getting into like 3 to 7 day stretches of really hot weather and those hutch raised calves. We do that, and we have that regimen, shall we say, ongoing at major calf ranches, especially in the western regions during hot temperatures.
I'm glad that you mentioned that as a recommendation too, because ultimately we just want to optimize calf health, right? And prevent some of these health challenges that environmental stresses or other factors can really contribute to causing stress for calves. And so there are ways that we can kind of get ahead of some of those health challenges and ways that we can prevent them. We have another episode too that covers more of the details of using our colostrum to mimic transition milk. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that as a recommendation.
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you both. I know it's summertime where you're at, so you probably want to get back outside, or maybe you're avoiding the summer heat. But thank you both for joining us, and for our listeners, thanks for joining us for another episode of Beyond Colostrum.
Thank you for watching today's show. If you have questions about something you heard today, or maybe you have a topic you'd like us to address, leave us a message on Facebook. We'll talk again on Beyond Colostrum.